Welcome again to all participants to the second part of the Cisema Webinar Series 2021. My name is Anna.
And I'm Hamish.
And I'd like to start with some housekeeping. We will talk for about 50 minutes, allowing for a 10-minute Q&A at the end of the webinar. But feel free to post your questions in the chat box as your questions appear. We will send you the replay link in the week following this presentation. And if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint slides, please send us an email.
So first, we'd like to introduce Cisema to you. Cisema stands for China Service Management. We're a regulatory affairs consultant and CRO for China. We were founded in 2002 in Munich, Germany, and Beijing, China, by a former Siemens engineer. We now have 12 worldwide offices with nearly 100 full-time employees, most of those on the ground in China. Please sign up to our monthly newsletter, which you can find on our website.
A little bit more about us. I've been working for Cisema since 2013, and I assist medical device, IBD, and other life science manufacturers experience a smooth and efficient registration process in China. And I've been holding webinars and seminars in association with chambers of commerce, as well as trade organizations all around the world.
I'm Hamish. I'm COO at Cisema. I'm a lawyer by training, admitted in New South Wales, Australia, and Hong Kong, which has been my home for the last 6 years. And I formerly worked with UK Magic Circle firm Linklaters.
What we learned last time, as you know, this is the second session of our webinar series. Last time we set really the basis for the series. There we talked about the NMPA registration of medical devices and IVD and all the basic knowledge you need to have. And we will now post also the link in case you would like to watch the replay again. You can just click that or find Cisema on YouTube. Today's topic will be hot topics and latest regulatory changes. This will be a very colorful mix of different themes. Some of them will be interesting to some attendees, others to others attendees. And in the next session in September and in December this year, we will have more of a regulatory focus and a fixed theme again. And we did do a poll last time to see what you would be most interested in, but because we've had so many new people signing up, we will repeat this poll at the end of this webinar, and you can let us know what you want to hear in September.
So let's begin. And just to outline the broad framework, we'll start with the more high-level topics and then progress through pre-market approval to the filing itself and registration to the post-market situations. But as Anna said, there are quite discrete topics. So last week on 1st of June, a new top-level regulation for supervision and administration of medical devices took effect. This sounds momentous, and in some ways it is, but in fact the practical effect on manufacturers right now is limited. That's because the NMPA still must clarify the law with its own regulations, which are currently being drafted and finalized. Such top-level laws for various topics are passed by China's highest administrative authority, the PRC State Council, and numbered consecutively in the order which they're passed. Just a quick reminder of the hierarchy here. You start with laws at the highest level, followed by regulations, standards, and guidelines. And we set out on the slide here the relevant body that manages each of these. This new law is called Order 739 and replaces the existing Order 680, which dated from 2017. On the slide, we have set out a short history of the top-level regulation for medical device supervision and administration. Prior to the year 2000, there was in fact no safety law, and medical devices could be imported without restriction. Following Order 206 in the year 2000, an application form had to be submitted, but could be completed with relative ease. Then in 2014, with Order 650, there was a significant restructure and increase in supervision of medical devices. and this was further clarified in 2017 into the system we know today. Whilst Order 739 is now in effect and foreshadows a number of changes, which I'll talk about in the next slide, I want to emphasize again that the direct impact at this time, right now, on medical manufacturers is limited, because the detail of the new law will be clarified by subsidiary regulations that are still being drafted, and this may take another few months at least. So it's very important to watch this space.
Whilst there are still 8 chapters in the order with the same titles, 27 articles have been added and 70 articles were modified. These additions were primarily in the bolder chapters, which you can see on the slide on the left-hand side. And those relate to registration and filing, distribution and usage, as well as supervision and legal responsibilities.
So what are the key takeaways for medical device and IBD manufacturers importing to China? There's a couple of messages. Increased flexibility in the pre-market approval process, formalization of market authorization holder regime, an increased focus on whole of life cycle supervision, and increased liabilities where laws are breached. Of course, what this means in practice is still to be clarified. I mentioned the draft regulation, or rather regulations that NMPA will release. They have released a number of draft regulations already for review and comment, but these are still to be implemented. So in a little more detail, on the first point is perhaps most exciting from foreign manufacturers. There is provision that local China type testing can now be self-tested by manufacturers rather than done in an NMPA certified lab. The draft regulation for self-testing, which further clarifies this, was actually released just last week on June the 2nd, and proposes that the overseas manufacturer's lab will need to be accredited by the relevant government, but must follow the on-site verification guidelines of China quality management systems. Whilst potentially very interesting, because of course local type testing adds so much to the timeline and the cost, and in some ways the burden of the China regulation changes to the local testing requirement have, of course, I should remind you, been attempted before. For example, in 2017, local testing was made free of charge, but the local lobby for test labs is so strong, they effectively went on strike and refused to implement testing. This meant there was a huge drop in the number of registrations in 2017 and also 2018 somewhat, although there were some other considerations as well. The complement or the face-saving measure was that labs were allowed to implement accelerated testing for which they could charge. Of course, this meant that if one applied for the free testing, they almost never had their testing completed. So in practice, the system sort of stayed the same. Whilst we're not sure how this is going to play out in reality here, we just want to warn manufacturers that whilst there is a very promising change on the horizon, it's too early to say how this is going to work in practice. Another emphasis is on innovation in the new Order 739, with innovation devices eligible for quicker NMPA review time and allocation of a dedicated reviewer throughout the NMPA application, and innovative devices defined as a product with cutting-edge technology, significant clinical application, and its own China patent. Importantly, these devices don't need home country approval before applying to the NMPA. As you will be aware, for imported devices, you always otherwise need home country approval first. There is also now scope for a more considered risk-based approach to clinical evaluation. This would mean that clinical trials may not be needed even when there is no existing predicate device. Where clinical trials are required, hospitals' capabilities to run them will now be a criteria for their ranking, which should greatly incentivize hospitals to increase their trial capacity and expertise. In a more product-related point, lab-developed tests, or LDTs, are also now allowed to be used by medical institutions for their own clinical purposes, if clinical needs cannot be met by approved IBD reagents. So the second broad point relates to market authorization holder regime, which is now formalized for domestic manufacturers. Manufacturers outside of China will be familiar with the concept of separating design and manufacturing, but in China it has previously been required that these be the same entity. Another broad point is the general shift in emphasis from point-in-time registration to whole-of-life cycle supervision has been formalized, including with the establishment of a system for professional inspectors. Whilst inspection of domestic manufacturers is routine, overseas manufacturer inspections have traditionally been very limited, although we have assisted our customers with a number of them. There is the potential that these may increase in future. The final high-level point we'd like to draw out is that liabilities penalties have been increased by around 50% on entities and key individuals for illegal acts such as sale of unapproved or non-conforming items. Personal liability is also now introduced on legal representatives, principal responsible persons, and other key personnel. So there's quite a lot to take in there, but the high-level point is there's some interesting new changes from a high-level top-down perspective, but the final detail is very much still to come through. So watch this space over the next 3 to 6 months.
Now I'd like to move on to classification, and this is something we definitely covered in the last webinar, but I would like to draw your attention to some of the changes. So let's have a brief revision of how classification works on the left side. First, you look at the medical device classification catalog, which is vividly provided with many examples. And if a device cannot be clearly classified, then the rules for medical device classification apply. And in borderline cases, there is also the possibility to apply for an official classification application with the NMPA.
Yeah, in China, medical devices tend to be classified higher than in other countries, and the fact that NMPA down-classifies some products shows perhaps that the regulator realized it was too strict in some circumstances.
Yes, so as you can see on the right-hand side, in December, the classification catalog was revised. And also for your information, in November last year, the NMPA actually released a draft document proposing a new procedure which would allow a more dynamic amendment of the medical device classification catalog. And according to this draft, it would allow overseas manufacturers to submit some classification catalog suggestions to the regulator in China, and this approach again would provide a more risk-based and internationally recognized pathway for medical device classification. This would also be in line with a lot of the things we read in the
739, and it shows the increasing maturity of the regulation here. Helpfully, the NMPA has publicly released 2 batches of classification results in 2020. Showing and identifying whether products are class 1, 2, or 3, device parts, or drug or device combination devices. As shown on the bottom right of the slide, a total of 225 products are no longer classified as medical devices. Some products which are now classified as non-medical, not regulated as medical devices, include birth bathtubs, and actually Cisema helped with the application to determine this, sleep monitors, electric toothbrushes, denture molding fluids, nasal sprays, and a number of others. If you're interested in some more examples, please let us know.
In our last webinar, I already mentioned that the NMPA finally updated the IBD reagent classification. And NMPA's release of this updated product information of 29 IBD reagents in October last year, primarily again to down classify from class 3 to 2, was really long overdue. And back then, when they updated the product description, this affected 29 IBD reagents in the subcategory 6840. And products that were affected were, for instance, kappa light chain test kits or test kits for tumor and cancer diseases. And what I'd like to mention now is that in May 2021, the NMPA also released a draft for IBD classification rules. And I've included the table again and highlighted in red some of the suggestions this draft makes, including that allergen testing will potentially be class 2 rather than 3 in future. And again, a reminder, IBD reagents labeled with radionuclides or used for blood source screening fall under drug regulations, so they're not regulated as medical devices.
So in March of this year, the NMPA announced the implementation of a medical device master filing system in China with immediate effect. This follows a draft published in January 2019. Some people might be familiar with the drug master file. This system is already used for a number of years in the pharmaceutical side of the life sciences industry, and we support a number of customers with pharmaceutical ingredient, packaging material suppliers. So before, suppliers had to provide all of their documents every time one of their clients, a medical device manufacturer, was preparing an NMPA registration submission. With this new regulation and regime, the suppliers can submit their own technical documents just once and directly to the NMPA CMD through a separate online account. The materials and component suppliers can provide their master file code to the medical device manufacturer applicant that is applying for the NMPA registration and authorize them to use the technical data in the device registration without directly disclosing the content to their customer, the medical device manufacturer. The purpose of the MDMF is to protect the intellectual property of all parties involved and smooth the registration process.
With regards to the scope, the medical device master file can support the application of class 2 and 3 imported medical device applications, as well as class 3 domestic, so Chinese medical device for registrations and renewals and changes, etc. With regards to the principles, the registration of the medical device master file is voluntary, and overseas medical device master file holders must authorize a local agent to represent them in China. Excuse me. The owner of the medical device master file can submit the information through the registration platform and then obtain the medical device master file number or code, and the CMDE, the Center for Medical Device Evaluation of the NMPA, will then review these main documents after the related medical device has applied for NMPA registration. With regards to the format, it basically covers any technical data information required for such an NMPA registration, such as confidential design and manufacturing information of raw materials, components, ingredients, or accessories of medical devices. However, at this time, the format may not be suitable for some specific information, such as IBD raw material. So yeah, this is something we have to see how it develops.
So moving on to another discrete topic here, combination products. They are increasingly gaining attention by the NMPA, and there have been some recent long overdue changes. The classification process for these products is key, and this includes an early dialogue we recommend to ensure maximum efficiency for the registration. So the process to do that is first to check whether the product has been approved in China or not, the product category. For this, we would check for our customers the medical device classification category, because combination products are also included in the catalog code, and every once in a while NMPA will publish the list of products that are defined as drug device combination products. If a certain kind of combination product has not been approved in China before, you will need to apply for a classification with the NMPA. The NMPA Standardization Management Center is in charge of combination device classification and the definition of product attributes of combination products. So after classification application, the NMPA will give a judgment whether it is a combination product, medical device, or a drug.
On November 6th, the Center for Medical Device Evaluation of the NMPA also published information about some very common issues that reappear and technical difficulties for applicants registering drug-device combination products in China. And on the slide, you can see the 5 most common issues. First, that applicants submit insufficient information of the drug or drugs involved. And here it's just important that applicants should include any related study research data and state the source and standard requirements of the drug, and that they include detailed information about the drug's usage to ensure that the drug is safe and effective. Secondly, the CMDE has noticed that often insufficient rationality is submitted for the choice of drug and medical device combination, and here applicants should really consider whether there are any drug resistance cases in the Chinese population, or if there have been any clinically effective treatment cases of the drug in the past. Thirdly, there have been multiple cases of insufficient consideration of the increased risks due to the drug and device interactions. And each individual drug as well as device component could have many affecting factors such as formula ratio, changes in the polymer carrier, material aging, and these are all things that applicants should consider in the application. Fourth, the CMDE noted that insufficient consideration is given to the chemical reaction affecting the combination product and its components. And lastly, that insufficient consideration is given to the intended clinical performance of the combination product, and in particular, the drug dosage, which is key to achieve the desired effects, and a key indicator to determine if a combination product is safe to use.
So as you can see on the slide, for a long time, NMPA notice of 2009 was for drug device combination products was the main relevant guideline. But in September last year, a new notice was issued to consolidate information from manufacturers and analyze the technical problems existing in the review and approval of drug device combination products. This was to be able to better guide applicants in future in preparing and writing the registration application. In January of this year, this led to a long overdue amended regulation, which is still in draft. The new draft refines the 2009 version with 8 major changes, whilst the definition of drug device combination products remains unchanged. The purpose of the change is to clarify the registration requirements and the categorization method of different drug device combination products. Importantly, one change is home country approval of the device or drug will no longer necessarily be required prior to the NMPA application. With this, will allow a more flexible global approach to companies' global filing strategies. We expect NMPA will implement a new set of technical review guidelines soon for the applicants to follow when registering their products.
Now let's move on to a different topic, which is the different clinical pathways available. And we will revise some of the points that we discussed in the last webinar and add all the regulatory updates regarding this. So the default position is that all Class 2 and 3 products must undergo clinical trial in China in order to support their NMPA registration. But as we discussed in the last webinar, there are different clinical pathways available. The first step is to look at the clinical trial exemption catalog. And in January this year, the NMPA announced the new clinical trial exemption list for medical devices and IBD reagents. It is an effort to implement a more risk-based clinical evaluation, and the NMPA has actually updated this list almost annually since it was first released in 2014. So if you find your product on this list, clinical trials won't be required. And instead, you submit a simplified clinical evaluation report. Most recently added were, for instance, metal locking bone plates, this is a class 3 medical device, as well as the IBD reagent, the antibody test for mumps virus. Therefore, it is very important to check whether your products are mentioned in the most recent version of the clinical trial exemption list. But also an incorrect interpretation would be very bad. So make sure that you find your product and whether it matches some of the others in the list, because otherwise it would be quite time-consuming. Yeah, exactly.
So, in addition to the exemption list, there is also a clinical trial mandatory list. And NMPA published a final version of the catalogue of class 3 devices requiring clinical trial approval in September last year. This revised catalogue gives general principles for these products, and it adjusts the description for 6 general product groups, and it deletes 2 product groups and updates the classification code. So the broad groups are implantable cardiac pacemakers, blood pumps, artificial heart valves, tissue engineering medical products, and long bone internal fixation products. The good news is that even though clinical trial data is required, you still may use overseas clinical trial data. And I should also mention that the local clinical trial in China, if you choose to do this, or if you need to do this because you don't have overseas clinical trial data or don't have sufficient overseas clinical trial data, this clinical trial must be approved by the NMPA. Usually, to do a clinical trial in China, just a notification is sufficient.
As Hamish just mentioned, even if you are mentioned on this list, then a overseas clinical trial data might be accepted. And interestingly here is that in November last year, finally the NMPA also published a draft that this pathway will be accessible for IVDs in future. Since 2018, this is a possible option for medical devices, and now this draft suggests that IVDs will also have access if the clinical trial data is complete and if Chinese population data is included, if the ethical opinions, the clinical trial protocol, and the clinical trial reports are complete, authenticated, reliable, and traceable, and if the differences between the domestic and overseas clinical trials are addressed. Differences such as different clinical trial quality management system or genetic information among different populations, for instance. Then there is one other topic, one other pathway, which is the predicate device routes. So if you can locate a predicate device that has already successfully gained registration in China, this is another option. But I'm going to skip over this because there have been no recent announcements. But instead, we're going to go to a much more interesting topic, which is real-world data.
So in November 2020, the NMPA published a trial technical guideline on real-world data. This followed a consultation process begun in December of 2019. The technical guideline specifies that qualified real-world data includes hospital electronic record data, medical insurance data, including government and business insurance data, and registered research data. This is usually focused on alternative pathways like Hainan Pilot Zone or more recently the Greater Bay Area. Although in trial version, the guideline has in fact been implemented, and it therefore permits applicants to draw on their real-world evidence generated in home country or other markets to reduce China clinical trial case numbers, thereby decreasing time and cost of a China clinical trial where that is required, or to do away with a local China clinical trial altogether, where the real-world evidence gathered from the data is sufficient. So, and the first product approved using only real-world data instead of a full clinical trial occurred just in April of this year with the Juvederm Volbella lip enhancement product. It used real-world data collected in the high-end zone, and you can find details on the clinicaltrials.gov website. It used had around 170 patients. So if all this is a bit too confusing, we have a popular service for our customers that is a feasibility study report that examines scientifically what data you have and what will best suit your product for the registration pathway into China. If you'd like to know more, please get in touch. And of course, if it's determined that clinical trials are needed, then we can support you prepare, execute, and implement the clinical trial as well. Another discrete topic we're going to move on to here relates to cybersecurity. China's cybersecurity and personal information protection framework continues to develop and is rapidly changing. There are numerous potential important future changes on the horizon, so it's another space to watch. The key relevant regulation is the Chinese Cybersecurity Act, which is implemented with respect to medical device registration by a technical guideline in 2018, and a draft of which has been issued in September 2020. In particular, the cybersecurity protection of qualified devices must meet the requirements of privacy, integrity, and availability. What does that mean? Privacy, it means that the data can only be retrieved by authorized users within an authorized period by authorized means. Integrity means the data must be accurate and comprehensive and may not be altered without permissions. And availability means available and useful, only accessible by authorized users, cannot be altered without permission, and must be accessible and usable.
The cybersecurity law also has a data localization requirement, so that critical data must be stored within China and must not be transmitted outside of China unless a security assessment is passed. Network operators, such as hospitals, for instance, have specific obligations to monitor data leakage and loss of information, and they must also seek consent for data collection of personal information. In particular, genetic information is seen as highly sensitive and must not be held by non-Chinese companies. It is subject to close scrutiny by a special human genetics regulator. And when we talk about network software, this requires an additional self-assessment risk report regarding cybersecurity risk as part of the NMPA registration dossier. Now we're moving to a topic that I wouldn't call necessarily an update, a recent update, but something that we regard nevertheless as a hot topic because it continues to pose challenges and we get asked about it quite frequently. This is the issue of lifetime, because since 2014, the lifetime is a requirement on the Chinese label and in the user manual. It is an absolute necessity to include a lifetime validation test as part of the medical device registration. In case you didn't know, all medical devices must carry a Chinese label. I included a small screenshot here, and the label includes information regarding the production date and shelf life or expiry date. In 2019, the NMPA updated the technical review guidelines on lifetime specifically for active medical devices, and this seems to pose a challenge for a lot of registrants. Proof must be provided to show that the device still fulfills the technical requirements and that it is safe and effective to use, even beyond the lifetime. And how do you prove this? This can be done either in form of a long stability test, an accelerated long stability test, or by testing a device that had been used in the market for a number of years, like 10 years, and then is tested against the IFU.
So in November 2020, CMD published an interesting Q&A, which we'd like to share. It asks, or rather it answered the question of how do you determine the lifetime of a software product? The answer given was that the lifetime of a software is mostly determined by commercial factors. And software components have the same lifetime as the associated medical device and do not have to be assessed separately. So, however helpful, it's still interesting to know that CMD is publishing such blogs and technical discussions, and we recommend keeping an eye out for these to help with your submissions.
I should add maybe that they are published in Chinese, though. So now let's move on to a different topic. For the regulatory process itself, there have been some digital developments we would like to share. As you know, might be aware of, the ERPS system went online in 2019 and has brought much progress. And this electronic submission system basically supersedes the previous paper-based system. And since then, this whole system has matured a lot and has really improved a lot. The ERPS system is used for the electronic management of the entire medical device registration or renewal process, and this is beneficial for non-Chinese or overseas manufacturers because you just don't have to post original documents to China anymore. And by the mid of last year, over 25,000 applications had been processed by the system, and majority of them exclusively electronically, and they're just completely automatically sorted out by artificial intelligence, and this greatly improves the efficiency of the review and approval. In the past, it took someone 5 to 10 days to allocate the responsible department, and now it's done within a matter of seconds. Also, the NMPA issued a release in September last year with regards to allowing the usage of electronic signature submission, but paper-based signatures, of course, is still recognized.
So moving on to another hot topic, which is UDI, Unique Device Identifiers. In October of 2019, NMPA implemented its introduction of UDIs in China with a pilot phase that initially targeted high-risk devices, but with the foreshadowing that all devices would eventually be involved. The first batch, which was released in September 2019, revealed that enforcement was actually pushed back by a year. Then in October 2020, the due date, NMPA decided to again extend the pilot phase to be implemented from 1st of January of this year due to COVID impacts.
And on the slide, you can see what the UDI is made up out of. So according to the risk level and the traceability requirements of a medical device, the composition of a UDI is shown on the slide. The UDI can be either made up by either a DI alone, the device identification, or by a combination of DI and PI, PI standing for production information. Just to explain those two terms a little bit further, DI consists of static information. So that contains a manufacturer identification code, for instance, so the license holder, and the product code, identifying the model specification and packaging. And then on the other hand, the PI, the production information, this is more dynamic information. This includes codes related to the production process, the serial and batch number, or the production date and expiration date. And this is not necessarily mandatory. Nevertheless, there are some conventional differences between China and, let's say, the US, for instance. In China, manufacturing date is always put on the Chinese product label, and usually the supply chain and hospitals urge to include manufacturing date also in the UDI. The different packaging specifications of a product, including the minimum sales unit of a medical device, should be assigned different UDI codes. And the UDI code is basically made up of a combination of numbers and a barcode. And the UDI data carriers that come to mind are one-dimensional barcodes, two-dimensional barcodes, and radio frequency tags, or RFID. However, the last one, the RFID tags, they're currently not so widely used and not so popular in China, and I would probably advise to stick with the 1 or 2 dimensional barcodes for the time being for China. Also, the UDI database was made public last year, mid of last year, and it allows users to use search tools, download tools, and data sharing features. The UDI database is also linked to the National Health Security Database, the Registration Database, and the Adverse Event Database. Now, Hamish already mentioned that the medical devices that are affected by UDI are released in batches, and of course, if you are in the first batch, I would assume you probably already know this because the implementation date of 1st of January. Nevertheless, I want to include it here, especially because there has been a revision. So in the following 3 slides, you can see the first batch of medical devices. For instance, all of them are risk class 3, very high risk class. A lot of them are implanted devices, such as guide wires, or here you can see implantable drug delivery devices. So what I highlighted in red are the revised editions, also ear insertion prostheses. So this is the updated batch, and the NMPA will release more and more batches until eventually all medical devices in China have UDI. If you are included in the existing batch or in the upcoming batches, then you have to ask yourself, do you already use UDI abroad, for instance, issued by GS1? Then they are actually acknowledged in China. Otherwise, you have to apply for a UDI at GS1 in your home country, or you can entrust also your NMPA legal agent to apply for a UDI at one of the code issuing agencies in China. And on the slides, you can see that at present, there are only 3 code agencies that meet the requirements of the Chinese regulations and are accepted by NMPA. In addition to GS1 China, there's also the ZIIoT and also Alibaba. From January 1st this year, the first group of UDI medical devices shall have the barcodes, and on the slide here you can see the different action items that you would need to run through. What I'd like to highlight here is that, interestingly, point 3 is part of the registration application, whether that's a new application or a renewal. You already need to submit the DI code. Maybe you remember that would be the static part of the UDI regarding manufacturer information. And this is different to the US, for instance. In China, they already want you to submit this as part of the registration process.
So moving on to another discrete topic, a question our customers sometimes ask us is, if we register our product as an imported device and later want to localize production, what does this mean for our registration? Previously, this meant you had to start your registration essentially from scratch, but since September of last year, companies now have a streamlined process for localization. The key requirements to establish a foreign-owned enterprise and set up a local production site in China, which set out here on the slide, must be a current class 2 or 3 medical device, an IBD, already in the market and registered in China. You must refer to the dossier requirements of medical devices and IBDs. The original dossier, which was submitted for the imported device registration, will be utilized, including summaries, research material, a clinical evaluation report, risk analysis report, etc. The registration materials must be consistent with the original dossier for the imported device, obviously apart from
factory address, because that's what you're changing, yeah.
And the main raw materials and production processes shouldn't change, and the quality management system must be consistent with the previous one. NMPA focuses on the consistency and traceability of the quality management system, the QMS. Successfully registered foreign-owned enterprises must indicate the registration number of the imported device from the original registration in the new registration certificate. The manufacturing in China should include the complete production process from the start phase to the end phase of the product. This means not only performing packaging and sterilization will be sufficient, so the manufacturer should be able to control the product quality throughout the defined main producing process. Products should be produced by foreign invested enterprises established in China by the registrant, whilst on-site production is possible through subsidiaries and joint ventures, but subcontracting is not permitted for the scope of transferring the manufacturing from overseas to China. So we have a little case study here. The first import to local medical device was approved according to the Shanghai NMPA, which released an announcement on the 1st of April of this year. Philips Ultrasound Shanghai transferred the production of its ultrasound probe, a class 2 medical device, to two Chinese subsidiaries in Shanghai and Jiangsu. Previously, this probe had been imported only. The application for approval was submitted in November 2020, and the technical examination was completed by March 15th of this year.
And then the approval was given in April, so yeah, a much faster process than having to do everything from scratch again. Now let's move to some more post-market vigilance and surveillance topics. In May and July last year, the NMPA provided important details on the ongoing reporting requirements for NMPA-registered medical devices, including IBDs. The NMPA's Medical Device Supervision Department, it's quite a mouthful, it's the National Center for Adverse Drug Reaction Monitoring, has explained the timescale and the data collection scope for preparing and submitting the so-called Periodic Risk Evaluation Report, PRER, for medical devices. And this PRER for Class 1 medical devices has to be prepared annually for the first 5 years, but actually only submitted upon request. And after the 5 years, you just can stop that. And then for risk class 2 and 3, you have to prepare the PRER on an annual basis and submit it through the NMPA Adverse Event Reporting System. And after the first 5 years, which is when you've done your renewal for the first time, then it's sufficient to just prepare the PRER and only submit it upon request. This new reporting requirement is also consistent with a lot of NMPA's push for continuous post-market surveillance.
Yeah, it fits in with the 739 order that we talked about.
Exactly. And since 2018, you really can see the shift of attention of NMPA away from just pre-markets to the full life cycle of medical devices. And annual reporting regulations are increasingly strict. It is also important for companies with registered devices to be vigilant and not to forget about regulatory matters after they have gained successful NMPA registration, and also the role of the NMPA legal agent, the representative in China, is increasingly important. With regards to the basic requirements of the PRER, it resembles a lot the PSUR, the European Periodic Safety Update Report, but still you should carefully review and implement the Chinese requirements.
So just continuing on this PMS theme, in November 2020, the NMPA issued a guideline for standard procedure that manufacturers shall follow when submitting risk evaluation reports after an adverse event. According to the guidelines, the medical device registrant or filing person are advised to investigate, analyze, and evaluate the occurrence of the adverse event within a short turnaround time. The medical device registrant or filing person should be prepared to carry out a risk evaluation report if unreasonable risks of the product are identified, and this could be required by the respective MPA or self-initiated by the medical device registrant or filing person. They want to stay on top of their filing. If asked by a government official to submit the risk evaluation report, it should always be submitted directly to the National Center for ADR Monitoring in China, which Anna mentioned earlier. Otherwise, if the risk evaluation work is self-initiated, then the report should only be submitted to the local NMPA, who should then forward it to the National Centre for ADR Monitoring. This, again, shows that the NMPA legal agent is playing a far more important role, and so please be wary and stay on top of your NMPA legal agent and make sure you're in close cooperation with them for ongoing regulatory compliance.
Yeah, because the NMPA legal agent becomes active and plays a very important supportive role when it comes to adverse events in China. Now, also in March this year, the NMPA issued an adverse event report about last year. What happened last year? They summarized that over 530,000 reports were filed of adverse events. This is an increase of 35%. I wouldn't say this is necessarily because there were more adverse events, but because more adverse events were reported, and it shows that the whole system is maturing more and more. Also, they gave information about the degree of risk of adverse events that happen, and also the ratio between passive and active medical devices. Here you can see in the pie charts on the slide. By device category, it's the infusion and protection equipment that got most reports, followed by diagnostic and monitoring equipment and physical therapy devices. Also, the report mentions that the NMPA pays attention to international cooperation of post-market surveillance, and that they also look at some adverse event publishings from other countries like US, UK, Australia, and Canada.
So just the last point we want to cover is AI products. To demonstrate the importance with which the Chinese regulator is committed to AI, machine learning, and deep learning, which are all the buzzwords. In March 2019, it established a medical device standardization unit for AI, responsible for terminology and processes for development and quality assurance. It also established an online cooperation platform with various institutions, hospitals, and you can see the link to that on the slide, although it is in Chinese, of course. As to the regulation that has come through so far, in June 2019, the NMPA released its first guidance on deep learning products, demonstrating its commitment to this type of high-tech product. Perhaps more interestingly, or to show the increased interest here, the most recent draft guideline, it relates to AI products. It will divide AI software into 4 application directions according to intended use: decision support software, image data processing software, analysis and data mining products, and medical assistance products. Only the first 2 will be regulated as medical devices, 3 and 4 will not. So this regulation, once implemented, will be a welcome addition to clarification around these high-tech product regulation. All these products are envisioned to be class 3 by default because the practical risks are still being identified, but there's some scope for them being down classified at a later stage.
As a medical device manufacturer, you may be asking, what are the implications of all the information we covered today, or why is this important to me?
And Anna, the implications are that no matter what product or risk class your category, your medical device or IBD is, it all starts with regulatory. It is your foundation for entering the Chinese market and ensuring you're compliant throughout your product lifecycle. Of course, once your product is registered, you must make sure you continue compliance. And as you can see from all the huge volume of updates in just the last year, this is a very frequently moving space. Please feel free to reach out. You have our details here, or check our website, sign up to our newsletter, and we'd love to stay in touch. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.